All right. Yes, yes. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the 80/20 of mixing. I am really excited to present this to you. This is all information that I wish I knew years ago. This is all the stuff that when I came across it, I was like, what was I doing before I knew this? Oh my God, I could have saved myself. All my tracks before I knew this are terrible now. I can't listen to them anymore. Oh, if only someone had told me. So it's been my goal to put all of these insights into one place to help you make your music the music that you hear in your head. So I want to let you know too that I'm going to be covering a lot of these subjects kind of like very briefly. The idea with this 80/20 series is to basically get you hip to what you need to be focusing on and not go into like super detail on any of these things. Now, in the weekly download, there are specific weekly downloads about all of the subject areas that I'm going to cover. So if you do want more detail on any of these subjects, now that you'll know what to look for, you can go and get the detailed version in the weekly download. Okay, so welcome to the 80/20 of mixing. This is a workshop filled with all of the things that I wish I had a time machine or a time machine message system so that I could tell myself in the past, because every one of these things would have been a game changer if I had known it earlier in my music career. So if you've not heard about these things or whatever, don't feel bad. Nobody's born knowing all of this stuff. And anyone cool is not going to judge you on whether you are knowledgeable about every single thing about music or not. Anyone who is actually cool is going to judge you on whether you are a good person or not. And that's, if you're going to be judging people, you should be judging them on how they treat others, not on, whether they know the difference between a FET compressor and an optical compressor. Those are just not the most important things. So please, if you are suffering from any of the things that I'm highlighting, please don't take them personally. And I also, before we get into this, I need to be super, super, super clear that everything that I am going to tell you today does not constitute a right or correct way of doing things, because there is no right or correct way of doing things in a subjective field like art or music or what have you. Okay. So what sounds good today may sound bad tomorrow. What sounds bad today may sound good tomorrow. What sounds good to one person may sound bad to another person, and what sounds good to that person may sound bad to someone else. There are no absolutes in music, and properly understood, the history of electronic music is a history of innovators who broke the rules and established new norms. Many of the biggest innovations in electronic music happened by accident. Many of the biggest innovations in electronic music happened from people who did not read the manual, did not go to audio school, and used things quote unquote wrong. So repurposing something for a new purpose is known in the development community as hacking. Okay? When you take one thing and use it for something else, that is hacking. So I want you to think about these innovations as hacks, as ways that these producers repurposed their tools and changed the way we see music. So A short list of examples of what I'm talking about includes, but is not necessarily limited to, the invention of scratching. What's the first thing your parents would tell you not to do when playing a record? Don't touch the turntable while the record's moving. You'll break it and it will sound terrible, was the conventional wisdom until the creation of turntablism, which is based exactly on touching the record and exactly on touching the turntables. It is one of the biggest innovations in electronic music and has a long and wonderful history that we all enjoy. Another thing that they used to tell you, and a lot of people still do tell you, is do commit plagiarism. Do not steal other people's sounds and use them in your music. But then along comes the sampler, and suddenly a whole genre of music, hip hop, is born by illegally repurposing other people's music. And if sampling is wrong, I don't want to be right. I think we just need to update our ideas about copyright. Okay, so another really huge innovation is the 808. When people think about 808s, they think about bass, but the 808 is a drum machine. When people started sampling the longest kick drum that drum machine can make and using that as a sub-bass tone, Miami bass music was born and led to, like, dubstep and trap and all kinds of other things. And that was by using a drum machine incorrectly. The TB-303 that is famous for the acid sound that you hear in acid music is actually for making bass lines. The B in TB-303 stands for bassline. And the idea was that this would be an automated bassline player where you could program in the bassline for a song and then jam on top to practice. But then some innovators in Chicago got their hands on what was at the time a commercial flop. Like, you used to see people would just use TB-303s as doorstops. Now they're like thousands of dollars for this little device that used to be like, $150. And these innovators got their hands on it, turned all the knobs all the way up, including the pitch, and made the squelchy, repetitive acid riffs that turned into acid house and swept the world up into the rave movement. All right. There's a lot of times when you'll push a piece of technology to the limits and it will create artifacts, like think of a CD skipping or a record starting and stopping. These technological artifacts or glitches were repurposed to create a whole genre of music and aesthetic built around glitch, built around things going wrong. And glitch music is one of my favorite genres of music, and it to this day is constantly growing, and there are whole genres of plugins just dedicated to making new and different glitches, right? Don't redline on the master. Digital clipping is always bad. That is another convention that was totally dogma for years until certain producers started redlining the Ableton master instead of putting a limiter on it, and found that they could get a more open and brighter sound, and that in some circumstances, that you will actually get a much more transparent limit on your levels if you use hard digital clipping to remove tiny peaks than if you use a limiter. We will get into that later in this presentation, but a lot of the big, loud, super dimensional sound of modern electronic music is built around using harsh digital clipping, especially in the mixing and mastering process. So I want you to keep that in mind, because Basically, every single convention should be questioned. Every rule should be broken at some point. Every underlying assumption that is prevalent around you in the music space should be undermined at some point. It's just a good idea to learn about what these assumptions and conventions are, so that you can question them in a more intentional and artistic manner. Okay. So when breaking the rules, like a child breaks the rules because they don't know the rules, but an artist breaks the rules to push their art forwards. And an artist knows they're breaking the rules and a child does not. So these are not, like, all the information here should not be thought of as rules or a correct way. These are all just things that I have found extremely useful to know in my own practice of making music. But I am not claiming that this is the right way. I'm not claiming that this is the correct way. I'm just trying to empower you to make better music and to be able to more easily realize the music that you hear in your imagination. So please don't take any of this as personal attacks. Please don't take any of this as gatekeeping. Please don't take any of this as trying to enforce a correct way of working. These are just some things that I think will help because I have found them extremely helpful in my own practice. And once again, we're going to be just kind of highlighting certain areas that are things you should know about. For more detail, check out the weekly download at theweeklydownload.com. All right, let's get into it. So some topics we are going to cover in this two-parter on the 80/20 of mixing are making reference playlists. Extremely important to collect references because there are no absolutes, but there are references. Then, to better understand our reference tracks, we're going to go into using visual analyzers, and I'll show you my favorite analyzer that I use every day in the studio. Then we're going to talk about the dimensions of the mix. These will teach you what to listen for when you're analyzing references, right? Like, the visual analyzers, they're not there to replace your ears. They're there to help teach your ears, but I'm here to help teach your ears too. So I'm going to show you some areas of the mix that I like to focus on when I am comparing my own music to the music that I want my music to be adjacent to. So the first one is the three extremes, and these are the extreme edges of the frame, so to speak, on your tracks. You've got the air frequencies up top, you've got the sub-bass frequencies down below, and then you've got the side-only signals, which are created when you subtract just what is the same from the two speakers, the mono signal. When you extract the mono signal, leaving only the differences between the left and right, that's when you get the side signals. Then we're going to talk about the pain zone, which is the area where the human ear is the most sensitive, and a dimension that I really like to pay careful attention to when I'm mixing is transients. And the transients are those initial explosions of sound, explosions of volume at the beginning of a sound that has a percussive nature. So yes, drums often have these transients, but so do things like acoustic guitars and harps. You know, there are transients all over the place that you should be paying attention to and kind of structuring them so that your mix makes sense. Then from this technical aspect, we will go into the subjective aspects of mixing because contrast, texture, imperfections, etc., can all serve a very powerful role in your mixes. Then from there, we're going to talk about focus and minimalism. How do you guide the listener's attention to the areas of the mix that you want to stand out? And this lack of focus is a big giveaway when someone is still developing as a mix engineer and as a composer. Now, those are kind of more compositional dimensions to mixing, but there is a very important relationship between mixing, composition, and sound design that I go into in another workshop that I call Composing the Mix. Because I have found that again and again and again, I will encounter emerging producers who will be 100% in their confident in their songwriting and everything, and be just certain that if they just had that plugin that they saw on Instagram, that then it would be easy, you know. And they're just constantly like, oh, if I only had this, if I only had that, if I only had the other thing, you know, why do my mixes suck? I need more plugins, etc. Well, we're going to learn that that's not actually true. And we're also going to learn how composition is a fundamental aspect of your mix. And most of the time, when people have a mix that lacks focus, they can tell it's not quite like their references, but they're not appreciating the fact that there's just way too much stuff trying to fight for your attention. Okay, so we're going to talk about focus and minimalism in Mixed Dimensions 3. Then we're going to go into fidelity, and this is where most people who are ruining their mixes, this is where they are ruining their songs. Okay. Then we're also going to talk about EQ and filtering, and we're going to learn why over application of EQ and especially high pass filter is ruining all of your songs. Then we're going to talk about compression, OTT compression, and the problem with tails. We all love compression, but when you're turning everything up, sometimes you end up turning up all the tails as well. And you get this big pileup of noisy, rumbly reverb tails and decay phases and sounds getting in each other's way. We're going to go into how to avoid that. Then we're going to talk about transfer curves. This is volume in to volume out. You're probably used to seeing the knee diagram on a compressor, but saturation, limiting, and clippers can also be expressed with the same input to output volume curves. And we're going to learn about how these don't just shape the volume, but can actually augment the tone of the waveforms and are a very important tone shaping thing. They're not just for volumes. They are also for tone and texture. And when you properly understand transfer curves, this is like brain confetti stuff. Okay, transfer curves are the jam. I use transfer curves much more often than I use equalizers. Very, very useful. Then we're going to talk about gain staging. And I did a weekly download recently about gain staging, where I was able to make a bunch of stems from a random band on the internet sound like a finished commercial, ready to go track, just by setting the volumes correctly and clipping off the peaks with hard digital clipping. That's it. You know, people think they need EQ, they think they need compressor, they think they need all this stuff, but actually, you probably just need to learn gain staging. It's not sexy, it's not exciting, but if you properly gain stage your mixes, you will find the sounds sounding great in a high fidelity state, and that's awesome. Then we're going to talk about making some default racks, and I have a collection of default racks that are a bonus for anyone who purchases the weekly download bonus. Let's get into it. So let's talk about reference playlists. As I said before, good and bad are entirely subjective. They vary from listener to listener, and they also change over time. You know, listening to, you know, there's a lot of music that sounded great when it came out that just doesn't sound right anymore. And sometimes too, when you make really, really nice, highly produced versions of certain genres of music, it can actually ruin them. Like, I remember there was this huge uproar in the punk scene when the Dead Kennedys music was remastered and released. There was something wrong sounding about the Dead Kennedys when the production was done, quote unquote, right. So there are some wild variations possible within the spectrum of what's considered good and bad. And it is very hard to deal in absolutes when you're talking about mixing and when you're collecting reference tracks. But when you select reference tracks for translation, right, then you will be able to find something that can be true within the paradigm of the music and style that you want to create. So mix engineers, at least the good ones, they all fetishistically curate their reference playlists. They curate the heck out of those things. And anytime I've been into a studio that has a room that's like more than 100 grand worth of speakers and acoustic treatment, the first thing that the person who is proud of that room does is bust out their fetishistically curated reference playlist, often including things like Phil Collins or Enya or Bob Marley, but they may also include people like Tipper or Noisia. They're on my reference playlist. So translation is what you're looking for when you're selecting songs for any type of reference playlist. Translation means that the mix sounds good or like as it should on all playback systems. So one of the engineers who creates the music that I think translates the best across systems is Tipper. Dave Tipper is a legend. He basically created the new school breaks genre way back in the late 90s. And then he went on to create glitch hop as a genre. He was first in a lot of different ways for both of those genres. His importance to left field bass music cannot be overstated. And when you listen to his music anywhere, it always sounds good. It will sound good on a Bluetooth speaker. It'll sound good in mono. It'll sound good on laptop speakers. It'll sound good on your phone speakers. It'll sound good on a Function One. It'll sound good on a pretty bad PA too. And it will sound good on a home stereo. It sounds good everywhere it translates. That's what you're looking for, okay? Translation is good in the context of a reference playlist. So most of the top mixing engineers that I have encountered will have an all genre, all time reference list. And this list is what they use when they're going from studio to studio, or when they are at a show and they need to assess the differences in the sound system that they're working with from the one that they are used to. So this all genre, all time playlist, this is what you would take with you to the music store when you are testing different monitors and you want to figure out which monitors to use, or when you're testing different brands of headphones and you want to be able to compare them in a meaningful way. Because if you're listening to a song that you've never heard before, you can't tell if it's the playback system that is making it sound good, or if it is the original producer that is making it sound good. Whereas if you have familiarized yourself with this all genre, all time playlist that contains a wide variety of music that translates well, you will better be able to assess the merits of various headphones or monitors, and you will also be able to do a mix down in an unfamiliar room, which I have had to do many times. There are times when I'm on a deadline and I'm also on the road, and I might be producing at my buddy's house in an untreated room on KRK speakers, and I still need to make something that I can send out the door and be proud of years from now. And that's when that all genre, all time reference playlist comes in handy. So subgenre specific reference playlists, these are the ones that you're going to actually go back and forth on when you are working on a song in a given style. So this is especially important if you are trying to either create music in a genre that is unfamiliar, or if you get a remix gig doing a remix for an artist in a very different genre. I recently was doing a remix for a very famous Israeli producer named Captain Hook, who is a friend of mine, and he makes like full on Israeli style techno influenced psytrance, and that is not a genre that I am particularly well versed in, but I wanted to be able to respect the aesthetic and history of that genre when I did my remix. My first remix, I did not do any research into psytrance, and I made this version of the remix that I thought was great, but it didn't really hit home with Captain Hook and his team at Iboga Records, and it was only later when I actually was like, okay, I want to get to know this genre. You know, what are the defining features of this aesthetic, etc. Make me a playlist. And I got Captain Hook to make me a playlist. And you know what? By listening to it, especially at a technical level, I have actually warmed up to psytrance a little bit. I used to be just like blanket across the board anti-psytrance. But there are some things about it that are cool. There are some production techniques and conventions that I learned from that playlist that I have taken with me into my non-psytrance making life. And my musical abilities have been enriched by studying this outside genre that I was previously very dismissive of. So please keep an open mind when you are working with people in different genres, and recognize that there is good music in every genre out there. There's no genre that is entirely bad, and that there is always something you can learn from these playlists. But these subgenre specific playlists, they're going to help you actually mix. You're going to be able to learn, like, okay, how bright does a song need to be in this genre? How much impact do the drums need in this genre? How far forwards are the vocals, if there are any? How much subs should I have? What kind of loudness levels should I be aiming for, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This subgenre specific reference list is going to be how you make those decisions, so that when you make a track and it's either on the radio with a bunch of other pieces of music that are in a similar bucket, or whether it is being used in a DJ set, and the DJ needs to be able to transition seamlessly between another artist's music and yours. If you have not made your track informed by these subgenre specific references, it may sound jarring and strange to the audience when a DJ transitions in or out of your music. And if you're making music for DJs, you don't want that. So you will want to curate subgenre specific reference playlists and listen to them across sound systems, okay? Make sure that you've listened to these tracks, like this whole playlist, all the way through on lots of different sound systems, you know, on your phone, on a PA, in the car, in headphones, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Actually listen to it across systems, and you'll be able to better understand why these mixes translate, so that you can replicate it in your own music. So now when you are working, you're going to want to use visual analyzers. I did not use visual analyzers for a very long time when I was starting out. Not just because they didn't exist when I was starting out. Well, at least I wasn't making music on a computer. My MPC did not have a spectrum analyzer. It just had, you know, filter on and compressor on each sound, and then one global delay and one global reverb. So yeah, so I was not working with this, and I was making big mistakes with my earlier mix downs that were only revealed to me when I started being hardcore about my reference playlists, and when I started using visual analyzers. Okay, so Camel Hotline asks here, he asks, when curating references, is it better to stream the songs or get a hold of a WAV/AIF from a downloadable marketplace? That is a good question. If you're streaming them off of SoundCloud, you're going to run into problems. SoundCloud has very, very low bit rate on their music, and I have noticed more encoding issues with SoundCloud than with any other place. Tidal is, of course, lossless. So when you're streaming on Tidal, you can get a very high resolution version of that audio. But if you go into the settings on Spotify, you can crank the quality up and remove all of their automatic normalization. And I do that a lot of the time when I'm referencing, and sometimes I will route the audio out of Spotify and into Ableton using a virtual channel inside of my sound card. And then I'll be able to record it, my reference track, right into Ableton from my sound card. Using the same setup that I use to stream my mic in when I'm doing these workshops, and that works really, really well. So yeah, you can crank the quality on Spotify and not have to worry about that as much. All right. So visual analyzers, once again, are not to replace listening, but to help you teach your ears, because 80% of the gains that you make as a music producer are from learning to really, really listen. To really, really listen. Listening better is one of the most important things you can do. And the temptation is to, when you're listening, to be like, listening for the names of sounds or the names of techniques, like, oh, that's a kick, that's a snare, that's a hi-hat, that's a et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a tendency for people, especially intelligent people, to use language in kind of a reductive way and to close their ears. But when you're looking on the spectrum analyzers and stuff, I find it helps me to listen to in a more abstract way. And I'm listening for just like highs or like, rich mids or whatever. I'm not really listening for the names of the sounds. I'm listening for like the balance of the sounds and what the functions that the sounds are doing. But yeah, so this is a way to train your ears. It's not a way to replace your ears. Okay, and you cannot be a deaf electronic music. It's all gone. Musician. It's All Gone Pete Tong is a great movie, but you need to hear what you're doing. Okay, it's the idea of being a deaf music producer is just, it wouldn't work. Okay, so what are you looking for in a spectrum analyzer or in these visualizers? So we're going to start with the spectrum, and that is in the top right of the spectrum analyzer that I've chosen to show you today. You can see that the colored rainbow area, that is representing the amplitude or volume of the different frequencies in the spectrum. And if you compare what you see here to what you see in, for example, FabFilter Pro Q or the Ableton Spectrum Analyzer, you will notice that the balance of the different frequencies looks different from visualizer to visualizer, and that the numbers are actually quite different as well. So when you are comparing them, just be aware that it's, they're all different. Like, yeah, you might have a spectrum analyzer in, one piece of software versus another, but they're going to tell you different things and they're going to display that information differently. So I would encourage you to compare, maybe have like a month where you download the demos of all of these different spectrum analyzers and really compare them, because they are all quite different from each other. Okay. So now in the bottom middle of the spectrum analyzer that I've chosen to show you, we have the phase correlation meter, which is a value between -1 to +1. That is at the bottom. And then you have this kind of like ectoplasmy ghost looking thing in the middle, which is what's known as a lissajou. And that is a way of visualizing the waveforms, kind of like an oscilloscope. And it's showing you the correlation between what's happening in the left ear and what's happening in the right ear. So if you go to the bottom meter, that value arc between -1 to +1 with 0 in the middle. -1 is when the sounds are out of phase with each other, which if summed to mono means they will cancel each other like noise canceling headphones do, because the two waveforms that are the opposite sum to be the same and they sum to be nothing. So -1 all the way on the right means your sound is perfectly mono. 0 means that the sounds have nothing to do with each other. You know, if you have a completely different sound coming out of the left ear and the right ear, you would get 0. A lot of reverbs and noise signals, if they're stereo and they're noise, will give you a 0 in the middle. So 0 is not necessarily bad, but -1 is necessarily bad if you're talking about mono compatibility, because -1 means that the waveforms are exactly inverse. And when summed to mono, if you sum 1 and -1, you get 0. So you do not want the waves to be opposite of each other. So you don't really necessarily need to know how to read the Lissajous like cloud thing in the middle, but any phase correlation meter is going to have -1, 0, and +1. And if you just keep that number between 0 and +1, things will translate better. All right, so now on the left, this is my favorite part of the Flux Analyzer, and this is why I am ride or die for the Flux Analyzer, and that is this chart here. It's a XY graph where you have the left and right speakers on the horizontal axis with the center in the middle. And then you have frequencies with the low frequencies at the bottom and the high frequencies at the top. And the colors there correlate to the colors on the spectrum meter in the top right. Now, this is telling you how wide the sound is, how much of a stereo image there is throughout the frequencies. And I have learned by analyzing reference tracks that I found particularly relevant. I have learned that generally speaking, you want the frequencies below 80, the sub-bass frequencies, to be in mono, and you want the most width between about 100 and about 500, and that fat bottom on like the Christmas tree shape, that's what you're going for. So, you know, when you first start, you might want to make all of your hi-hats super wide and all of your like noise risers super wide and stuff up in the 10K. But that can often make a mix sound a little weird, I've found. There may be a use for that weirdness. Maybe someone will come up with some kind of wildly outside the box mixing style that has dramatic width up in the 10K range. But I have found that it is often quite distracting and a bit confusing for your ears. But sometimes distraction and confusion can serve an artistic purpose. So it depends on what you're after. But most of the time, as Christina has pointed out in the chat, wide, dry highs, when you have sounds that have wide, dry highs, they usually will get in the way of whatever your main sound is. So if you want like a big bass sound to be like the primary focus, and there's lots of wide, dry highs on things like hi-hats and noise risers and stuff, a lot of the time that bass sound just isn't going to sound right because it's being cluttered by all of these wide, dry highs in the other sounds. So watch out for wide, dry highs. That is a very important tip. We'll get into that in some of the other sections. Once again, Flux Analyzer is my favorite spectrum analyzer. I think it's the best in the biz. I just love it, and I could not recommend it more. All right, so now let's talk about the dimensions of the mix, and let's talk about the objective dimensions, and these all will show up on your visual analyzer. These are what to look for and what to listen for so that the analyzer can help you teach your ears. So the sooner you learn to hear these dimensions, the better. So I recommend starting with what I like to call the 3 extremes, and these are the edges of the frame of your mix. Extreme number 1 is the highs that are above 8K. You often, like sub-bass, won't really hear these frequencies, but you can kind of like feel them. And the human hearing in an ideal world goes up to 20K or 20 kilohertz, 20,000 cycles per second. But most people who are above 30 can't really hear too well above like 12 to 14K. And it's especially true if you've suffered a lot of hearing damage. I have somehow miraculously been able to retain my hearing up to 16K despite being at live shows every weekend for like 20 years. I don't know how that worked, but you can test your own hearing with the test tone in the Ableton preferences and just sweep it up until you can't hear it anymore. That's very important because you may be adding stuff up there that you can't hear. So yeah. So the highs, the very, very highs, these are the frequencies that are known as the air, right? Just like there are low mids versus subs, there are highs and then there's air. So a lot of people will call this zone the air. And this is an important thing to draw your attention to. If you're focusing on what's happening in the mids, a lot of the time you might not notice this. So I have a rack that is in the rack pack of the defaults that comes with the special deal that we have, where you isolate just the frequencies above 8K and you listen all the way through, and you'll be able to learn a lot if you listen through your whole reference track like just above 8K and then listen through your whole track just above 8K. And I put every mix down I do through this test. Extreme number 2 is the sub bass, which is below 80 hertz. Okay, bass does not start at 150, 200. Sub bass starts, it's like 80 and below, maybe 80, maybe 90 and below. Okay, so the sub bass, I will often turn off my monitors and listen to my track all the way through just the sub bass, or I'll bump it really loud and like go to the next room and listen to it. And it just gives you a fresh perspective. And once, like with the highs, you might be fooling yourself into thinking there's more or less bass than there is because of what's happening, especially in the low mids. And there's this area in the low mids that I call the fake bass or the mud zone. That is between about 90 hertz and about 190 hertz. And that area of the frequency spectrum will take away power from your sub, because the crossover that separates, what frequencies go to the subwoofer versus what frequencies go to the mid driver on your typical playback system, especially a PA, you need to think about that in a non-linear way. Like basically, it's not like there's a hard division that nothing above 90 hertz is going to your sub bass and nothing below 90 hertz is going to your mid driver. It's like a crossover. So it's like a kind of like an X. The center of the X might be at 80 or 90 hertz on that sound system, but things from the low mids do get reproduced by the sub driver. And if there's too much volume in that fake bass mud zone, then that volume will take away the ability of the sub to be loud. Because when you're talking about gain in a track, it is a zero-sum game, quite literally. We're summing to zero. And when you have lots of frequencies present at once, the speakers are not giving all of their power to one frequency, so they cannot reproduce it as loud. You cannot reproduce all the frequencies at the same volume as you can reproduce a single frequency. A single frequency will be reproduced louder because it gets all of the gain in the system in one place. And this is also true within the crossovers of a PA system or other playback system. If your sub is trying to reproduce a bunch of mud coming from other bass sounds, or, maybe your kick has a lot of 90 hertz to 150 to 190, that's often true because a kick sweeps down in pitch. So often like the first part of the kick will be getting in the way, and the bottom on other sounds will be getting in the way. So you want to have like a dip above the subs, but it's a great idea to listen to only the subs all the way through. Okay, so listen to only the air all the way through, listen to only the subs all the way through. And then another extreme that it takes a bit of training to hear is the side only signals. And the Ableton utility device, if you right click on the width knob, you can put it into mid-side mode and then isolate just the mid or just the sides. And if you listen through only the sides on, for example, a MP3 at 128 kilohertz, you will be able to much more easily detect the MP3 artifacts when you listen to an MP3 with the sides only. The MP3 signal prioritizes the mono mix, and today's mixes are much wider and much less dynamic than the music was when the MP3 format was created. And a lot of modern tracks, they have a ton of stuff going on in the side only signal, and MP3 really struggles with that. So if you want to train yourself to hear what you're actually losing with MP3s, try listening to only the sides on MP3s, and you'll better be able to hear the sorts of digital artifacts that MP3s create. And there are other, sometimes plugins create similar sounding artifacts, and it's a good idea to train your ears to hear that. But it's also a good idea to just listen through, as we did with the Air and the subs, listen through your track versus your reference tracks with the side only, so that you can approach that with an intentionality. Okay, so that's the three extremes. And this is basically how you make a mix sound big. Is the highs above 8K, the subs below 80, and the side only signal. That's what makes a mix sound big. That's what makes a mix fill the frame. But in the center of this, the center of the frame, where the ear is the most sensitive, the human ear at any rate, is between 2.5 to 4,000 cycles per second. This is where all of the definition on human speech lives. If you were to notch out these frequencies when someone was speaking, you would not be able to understand the words. And it's been hypothesized that we are evolved to be the most sensitive to this particular frequency range because it is where babies' cries live. That's where a crying baby is typically in that zone. And, obviously, being sensitive to your baby's needs is how you stop them from dying. So there's definitely a survival value there. But it's also like language. And I mean, there's a lot of sounds like happening in that frequency range. So if you examine what's known as the Fletcher-Munson curve, which is a graph of the sensitivity of the human ear throughout the frequencies, you'll find that the balance of that changes pretty dramatically at different volumes, but that pretty much always the pain zone is the most, like at all volumes, the pain zone is the most likely, the most sensitive area. And that's why I call it the pain zone, because you might make something in your studio that sounds great to you on your studio monitors, and then you play it back on a PA system or a car, and people are like plugging their ears and screaming. Well, you may have a problem in the pain zone. So pay extra attention to the pain zone, because this is an area that can just ruin your mix. And it's the thing people are listening for the most is the pain zone. And even more than just activity in the pain zone, vocaloid formants in the pain zone. So these are speech-like sounds. So whether it is actual talking or a yoy dubstep formant bass, the vocaloid formants in that frequency range, they stimulate special modules in the brain that we have evolved for speech and language. And we can perceive a greater depth of information when we perceive a vocal sound than when we perceive an instrumental sound. And this is why, when you run a synthesizer through a preamp, you might not be able to tell the difference between a digital preamp and a really fancy, expensive analog preamp. But when you are processing vocals, bad processing on a vocal is very, very obvious, much more obvious than it is with a synthesizer. And that's because of these special vocaloid perception modules that we have in the brain. We have similar modules for faces, which is why we always see faces in Gansfeld or an ambiguous perceptual environment, like when everything's just grayed out, you start seeing faces, and like why clouds look like faces, or that burn on your toast looks like Jesus or whatever. It's because we have special face perception areas in the brain, and we also have special vocaloid perception areas in the brain. So be aware of those. That can be used to draw attention, and it could also be why something is taking attention that it shouldn't. Okay, and then another dimension of the mix that I think is just utterly crucial to pay attention to is transients. And these are the initial flick of volume on a percussion sound, that 0 to 60 jump right at the beginning. You will often get those on percussion sounds, but you may also find them on plucking type noises like an acoustic guitar or, a synth pluck or other types of instruments. So they're not just for drums. And a lot of the time, learning to get your mix balanced is actually a matter of taking away transients on the drums so that the melodic sounds can appear further forwards in the mix, because transients are very noticeable. If you have no transients on any of your loud sounds, your brain will be able to pick out a very quiet sound if it has transients. So, it's not just a matter of frequencies and levels. It's a matter of how those sounds are appearing. Okay, very, very important. But the transients, balancing the transients in your song, creating a hierarchy of transients, a hierarchy within the pain zone, a hierarchy within the side-only signal, a hierarchy within the subs, and a hierarchy in the air frequencies. All of these dimensions working together will help you to create a feeling of focus in the mix. And it will help you to have your mixes come out in a way that makes sense to you and makes sense to your listeners. So hierarchy. I am not such a fan of hierarchy in my social structures, but I am a big fan of hierarchy in my mixes. You should approach all of these dimensions with intent. All right. So listen for each of these dimensions and approach them with intent in your music. All right, so now let's talk about some less objective dimensions of the mix, okay? You will find that when you check out interviews or read written articles or books from really advanced mixing engineers, that a lot of advanced mixing concepts transcend a purely technical explanation. All right. A lot of them transcend a purely technical explanation. Oh boy, I got to get that to go away. There we go. Okay, so advanced mixing concepts often transcend technical explanation, which is why you will often hear Grammy Award-winning mix engineers describe things by saying that they're tubby or warm or silky, or other frustratingly unscientific and abstract terms. So please understand that these people are not using these terms because they're dumb. They're using these terms because there are times when technical terms do not suffice, right? Because your brain does not, yes, mathematics is intimately involved in sound, and your brain can perceive mathematical relationships between the sounds. For example, the ratios that lead to the 12-tone scale. Those ratios are kind of like octaves. Like, you don't need training to hear when that different octaves of a pitch are consonant with each other. But what people get out of music is more of just like a feeling and a subjective experience. Like, can we say why one chord is like a lovesick loneliness and another chord is a loneliness from necessary abandonment? Because it is possible to get that specific with the emotions that are in a chord progression. Why? It's a mystery. Nobody knows. Nobody knows why. And that's because we have a woefully incomplete understanding of consciousness and of perception. Okay? We have a woefully incomplete understanding. We don't even know what consciousness is. Like, is redness, is there something about the experience of redness that transcends the mere fact that fire trucks and roses share redness as a commonality? If I touch my hand to a hot stove, yes, there is a reflex that tells my nervous system, like your spine, your reflexes actually happen in your spine before they even get to your conscious awareness in the cortex. But if I get a burn on my hand, I'll pull my hand back from the hot stove. But aside from the fact that the pain is telling me not to touch stoves in the future, there is still something that it is like to be in pain that is beyond just the information that that sensation points to. There is a subjective feeling of being in pain that is impossible to explain to an AI. And that's why we do not have artificial consciousness yet, nor any plausible, even in a fictional film, any plausible idea of how artificial consciousness could be created. There is something, beyond the brain. There is the observer and the pilot of the brain. We don't know. We don't know what consciousness even is. So we can't explain things in a purely mathematical way. A lot of the time we need to resort to subjective terms like tubby, warm, or silky. So contrast is a very important thing to have in your mix. The differences in the sounds will make mixing easier. A lot of the time when people talk about mixing, they talk about resolving frequency masking. Frequency masking is best understood as the brain's inability to perceive two simultaneous sounds that are similar. Okay? But if you make the sounds different from each other, your brain will have an easier time perceiving them because it will use the commonalities of the texture and tone and other things to be able to fill in the blanks. It's like, let's say you are looking out of a window and the window has bars on it, and you see a car and the middle part of the car is obscured by one of the bars on the window you're looking out. Your brain is not going to have any trouble telling that that is a car because it can infer what is behind the bar from the rest of the information. So using different types of information to cue the brain which frequencies belong to different sounds will help resolve frequency masking much more than equalization will. Okay? It's very easy to tell apart two sounds when one has a stable pitch and one sound has an unstable pitch. It is very easy to tell two sounds apart when one of them is perfect and mathematical and one of them is imperfect and organic. If one sound has only long notes and another sound has only short notes, it will be very easy to tell the sound with short notes from the sound with long notes. If one sound is quantized perfectly to the grid and another sound is offset in some way, whether that is track delay or swing or groove from the groove pool or whatever, you're going to have a much easier time telling those sounds apart. And one of the best things that you can do for your mix is to apply track delay, to make sure that the sounds are not happening at the exact same time. That's like if you want to have anything else happen at the same time as your main big kick, it's going to be hard because that kick is taking up all of the gain in the system. But if the other sounds happen around the kick and they don't happen at exactly the same time because you're using the contrast of timing to set them apart from each other, your listener will have a much easier time telling which frequencies and amplitude belong to which sound or another. Okay, so contrast. Sounds don't go because they're different. or because they're the same, they go because they're different. You know, a mix, the separation that you're after in your mix, if you use the exact same EQ algorithm on everything, if you use the exact same compressor algorithm on everything, if all of your sounds come from the exact same synthesizer, etc. So watch out for the things that your channels have in common and try to make them have less in common if you want them to be easily perceived as separate things. So texture and tone are very, very important to being able to pick the sounds apart. And I like to advise people to familiarize themselves with all of the many flavors of distortion. How you need to know, how is overdrive different from bit reduction? How is saturation different from wave folding, etc., etc., etc. One of the most important things you can do as a music producer is to familiarize yourself with the different ways of creating texture and tone through flavors of distortion. And you also may want to add pitch instability, wow and flutter like you would have in an old tape deck. I find that that can really help make a sound sit on top of the mix, that little bit of instability. So there are a lot of free cassette tape emulators that are worthy of exploration. The Isotope Vinyl plugin is very, very good for this sort of thing. But you want to have a toolkit for creating different textures on top of your sounds. And when you're dealing with texture, remember that in a digital signal processing chain, each step of that chain is essentially resynthesizing the sound, right? So like if you have EQ last in the chain, yes, all of the things that were prior to the EQ in that chain influenced what you hear, but the actual sound that you hear is being synthesized 100% by the last device in the chain. So if all of your chains end with the same device, they're all going to have a similar texture. And likewise, if you are using a device for its texture, as for the XLN RC or Retro Color 20, as Rands has pointed out in the chat, that RC20 is an extremely useful tool. But if you're using it for its texture and then you apply the same EQ that ends every other chain, you're going to be undermining that textural difference. So whatever the last touch is the most important with texture and tone. And I have collected analog synths for a long time. I love the tone of analog synths, but once you sample an analog synth and run it through a bunch of digital processing, it often just sounds indistinguishable from your digital synths, right? So I've actually found that to make my music have an analog sound, I've found that using my hardware compressor, the FMR Really Nice Compressor, RNC 1773, very affordable. I've bought software plugins that cost more than that. It was $200. It's a stereo compressor. It's kind of modeled after the LA2A, and I love it. It's like a little, like if it could fit in a backpack, it sounds amazing. But I found that and my Electron analog heat, when I want that textural difference that analog provides, a lot of the time it's analog processing at the end of the chain, not the beginning, that makes the big textural or tonal difference. So imperfection, all of these things create imperfection. Imperfection is good in the context of mixing, you know? Imperfection is something to be embraced. Non-linearity is something to be embraced, okay? Because of the contrast and the variety that it can create in your your music. And then also a good deal of the emotional impact comes from the texture of the sounds. So imperfection is not bad. Imperfection is good in the context of mixing. So, where imperfection is very good is in the Japanese aesthetic concept of wabi-sabi. Wabi-sabi comes from Buddhism, and one of the Four Noble Truths is that all life is suffering. Another is that suffering originates in the mind. So how does the mind cause suffering? Well, if you ask a Buddhist, or actually if you ask the Stoics, the mind creates inappropriate expectations of reality. And when reality does not meet your inappropriate expectations, that is where a Buddhist would say suffering is created. And that is where, Marcus Aurelius and other Stoic philosophers like Seneca would say that anger originates in inappropriate, unrealistic expectations of reality. So the Japanese aesthetic of wabi-sabi is directly informed by this Buddhist knowledge in the Four Noble Truths, and it upholds as artistically valuable things that are incomplete, imperfect, and impermanent. Those are the three I's of wabi-sabi: incomplete, imperfect, and impermanent. And a lot of Japanese art is trying to embrace this world, this reality. It's not trying to, create this like perfect ideal world, because a Buddhist would say that, fetishizing this ideal of perfection is unrealistic and is going to make you suffer, right? So wabi-sabi is saying like, hey, art should uplift people, art should connect people to their reality, at least in this particular paradigm. So the incomplete, the imperfect, and the impermanent, those are the three I's of wabi-sabi. And if you explore wabi-sabi, if you type that into Google, you'll probably be able to get whole talks just on wabi-sabi. It's often, best exemplified by Japanese pottery, but it does exist throughout all Japanese artwork. And this is an aesthetic that I think you should embrace as a music producer, because you know what? No song is ever complete. No song is ever perfect. And music is impermanent, just like everything else. So you might as well lean in and learn how to make it work to your advantage. All right, so now we're getting into some of the most important areas of this little talk here, and this is focus. Okay, so we've got our reference tracks, we've got our analyzers, we've been listening in all of these different dimensions, but for what? What is the point of studying these different areas? What is the point of learning about these different dimensions? We must apply these different dimensions to our own music to create focus in the mix. Focus is how you lead the listener through the emotional journey that you've created. You don't want the listener to be noticing your accompaniment parts the first time they listen to it. You want their attention to be exactly where you planned on the first listen. And focus is what you are striving to create here. And this is because human brains need to simplify the world to perceive things properly, right? We make sweeping generalizations all the time. That's why stereotypes exist and why they're so problematic. They are a mental shorthand that we do to cut off all of the loose edges of reality and fit it into a tight, simple, reductive linguistic concept that our feeble human mind can grasp in an instant. And if you have ever done psychedelics, you will probably notice that when these filters, these simplification filters on your reality come off, and you are confronted with all of the sensory information that your senses are taking in at the same time, you will be completely paralyzed and unable to make decisions. And, brushing your teeth on acid can be a Herculean task because of the information overload. So while, these simplifications can be problematic, as with outgroup stereotypes and bigotry, these simplifications are always happening. They are how perception works. That's why there is what they call the magic number 7 plus or minus 3. Humans can remember, on average, 7 digits at a time, plus or minus 3. Some people can only hold 4 in their mind at a time. Some people can hold 10 digits in their mind at a time. But the average person can remember 7 digits plus or minus 3 at a time. And that's why phone numbers are, 7 digits plus the area code, right? So, our brains are always simplifying our environment, and in perceptual phenomena, that is called figure and ground in the visual sphere. If you're studying graphic design or art, you call them figure and ground, or a positive and negative space. So if you watch some of my other teachings, you'll often see me referring to negative space and the use of negative space in a composition. But I think the easiest way to understand this in terms of audio is that your listener's brain is always, unless they are, of course, ripped on acid, which it's fine. Writing music for people on acid is fun too. I've written music for people on acid, and you can break a lot of perceptual rules. But if you want your music to be able to make sense to people who are not so high on acid that they're basically paralyzed, you want to be intentional about how you present the focus of your mix. Whether you are talking about vocal music or instrumental music, the brain is always attempting to separate the singer and the band. If you're making, drum and bass, maybe the singer is some very interesting percussion parts. Or if you're making dubstep, maybe the singer sound is the sweet wubs that you're trying to make the center of attention. Or if you're making trap music, maybe the singer sound is just like the most annoying noise you could make with a bath toy. Who knows, right? But the mind of the listener is always going to be trying to separate out what is the most important thing at any one time and what other things are still entering into consciousness, but not as important as the focus. So I like to think about the singer and the band, whether I'm making electronic instrumental music or vocal music or what, you always want the singer to be in the spotlight and the band to be playing backup, okay? So the singer should be in front, on top, loudest, clearest, in the spotlight. It should be demanding your attention, right? Whereas the sounds in the band are working together, but they are actively avoiding drawing the listener's attention. So I'm going to say this once again, because this is one of the most important things to take home from this whole workshop, is that any sound that is not the focus should be actively trying to avoid drawing attention to itself so that the sound that is the focus can have the focus. When every sound in your song is just dripping with insecurity, trying to be like, I'm reinventing what a hi-hat even is. That, while it may be an interesting sound design exercise, etc., when every sound in your song is trying to scream, look how unique and clever I am, and then you're trying to have a focus at the same time, it's like trying to have a singer sing in a room full of people on cocaine talking about themselves, okay? It's not going to work. And this is one of the biggest problems that I see, especially people who like glitch music or experimental music or left field bass music or whatever. I love that stuff too. I make all that music myself, and I had to learn this lesson the hard way, okay? If you want your mixes to actually work, if you want your music to actually be listenable and make sense, you don't want to create a room full of cokeheads talking about themselves. You want the band to actively avoid the spotlight. And there are lots of sounds that I like to call ninja sounds that you do not even notice unless you're doing like a full track breakdown arrangement exercise type thing. The arrangement exercise is part of the weekly download that everybody needs to do. But the arrangement exercise is essentially where you basically load a track into your sequencer and then try to recreate with empty MIDI clips all of the sounds that you can hear so that you have a visual representation of the composition in that song. And when you listen in that way, well, providing yourself these visual markers for later, you will often notice all kinds of little sounds that you would never, ever notice. And the ninja sounds are just essential. Things like, vinyl crackle on top of drums, white noise on top of a bass sound, reverse crash going into a drop. I use the gas release from my Instant Pot as a riser all the time. These sounds I call them the ninja sounds, and they're basically there to make the song sound full without introducing any new elements to perception, right? So ninja sounds. Think about making your sounds ninja. Because I used to tell people, no, you need to have boring sounds in your song. Like if some of your sounds aren't a little bit boring, it's going to be too much for people. And a lot of people, they will do it like, no, every sound needs to be the coolest sound ever. And you can have sounds that are cool, but are ninja sounds. And it is cool to make a sound ninja. You will often find that like removing a transient makes a sound more ninja. Removing the highs makes a sound more ninja. Removing the edges makes a sound more ninja. Removing the pain zone makes a sound more ninja, right? And ninja, making a sound ninja, it should be something that you view as slick. It should be something that you view as a flex, not as being boring, not as being uncreative, but it is in its way a flex. Okay, so you want the singer sounds to sit in the spotlight on top and in front and demand attention, and you want most of the sounds in your song to be trying to actively avoid attention and acting as the band. For more on this, check out my Composing the Mix workshop. I go into lots of detail about the relationships of composition, sound design, and arrangement. So I have a concept that I like to draw people's attention to that I call compositional density. And this is, it can be viewed as the number of layers that are present at any one time in the mind of the listener, right? Because you might have one main vocal sound in your song that is actually composed of like 30 layers of yourself just singing the thing over and over and over and over again, just double tracking the hell out of it to create this like big wide choir effect. That's still going to be one thing. If they're singing the same words at the same time, and it's basically one sound to your listener. It might be 100 sounds in your DAW, but to the listener, it's one sound, right? So think from the perspective of a listener when you're assessing compositional density. And a lot of the best music has extremely minimal compositional density. Okay. And a lot of the music that is the most sound design focused and has the most radical sounding compositions has very low compositional density. I did a weekly download about compositional density the other week, and we listened to the new Imanu album, which from a technical perspective is extremely complex and very, very advanced music. But when we were actually numerating the compositional density as the song played, there was like at least half of the song where the compositional density was like 2, or 1, or even 0 in some parts, right? So the best way to focus is to remove distraction, right? Like think about the way an iPhone ad looks. It's just white and then there's an iPhone. That's the ad, right? The removing distractions creates focus just on its own, right? And Zen, you look at a lot of Zen art, it's just, there's so much negative space, so much emptiness, so much that's just clutter, just out of your conscious awareness. And that's a thing that's beautiful. It's not lazy to have a song that does not have very many sounds in it. It is actually lazy to have a song that has too many sounds in it, right? Because perfection is best conceived as think about it this way. Perfection is not when there's nothing left to add. It's when there's nothing that can be taken away. Perfection is not when there's nothing left to add. It's when there is nothing that can be taken away. And all of the things that remain are absolutely necessary, right? So, and this is you must be ruthless about eliminating unnecessary elements in your composition. Some people say it's not over till the fat lady sings. I say your composition process is not over until you've killed a puppy. It's got to be heartbreaking. You've got to be like, no, but I love that sound. I spent so much time on it. It's my favorite. I don't want, like, it should be like, you should be like, yeah, but got to be ruthless here. You should be like puppy killing levels of ruthless when you are lowering your compositional density, because your mixes are going to come out a lot better. The focus in your compositions is going to be a lot better. You'll be able to get your music louder. You'll be able to get it clearer. You'll be able to make it translate better across sound systems. Basically, everything about mixing is improved by lowering the compositional density, okay? And I did not know this when I started. I wish I did, because it would have saved me years, and there would be so many of my releases that I would be much more proud of if I had known about compositional density and the necessary ruthlessness of minimalism. Minimal isn't boring. Minimal is elegant. Minimal is refined. So there's a two-parter in the weekly download about minimalism that you should definitely check out if you have not checked it out already. So when you're trying to make sounds more ninja, a lot of the time group processing and bussing, even after your groups, it is good to unify sounds, because remember, texture helps the brain group things together. And when you have sounds in a group that are receiving perhaps some glue compressor, that's why they call it the glue compressor, is it makes the sounds feel more unified. This can be very important for percussion. But, you know, having one big side chain on everything can be another very effective way that group processing can make disparate sounds seem unified into a band. So group processing can be very useful, and always keep an eye out for useful group processing devices. And to help make the singer stand out, as I said before in that example, a classic studio technique is double tracking, where, you know, and if you're ever recording a vocalist, keep this in mind. You do not need them to just do the hook perfectly once. You want them to do the hook perfectly, like exactly the same 100 times. And then you can layer all of those up and pan them across left to right with like one nice loud one in the middle, and then just like slow, you know, how, like I call it the 5-finger pan. That's normally my minimum. Some people will do 3, where there's like one in the middle and then 2 hard pans, but I like to have 2 half pans as well. I find it a richer effect. But if your vocalist doesn't mind, I mean, get 100 layers and really stack them up, because the effect of those all together really makes it stand out and sound 3-dimensional. But you can emulate double tracking with very short delay times. You've probably heard of a slapback reverb. This is a reverb that is like one bounce off of a wall typically, and that's why reverbs have like a pre-delay parameter, is to create that initial decay so that you can get like a slapback. Because when you drown a vocal in reverb, it can kind of push things to the back of the mix, as front and back are a very like kind of subjective thing, based on, you know, how much highs there are, how dry a sound is versus how wet it is. And when sounds have like crispy transients and crispy highs, they seem closer to the front. And when sounds have less highs and less transients and more reverb or delay or other wet effects, they seem further to the back. So when you're trying to dimensionalize the singer and you want it to be wide but also up front, a lot of the time, if you put a lot of reverb on that sound, it will undermine the focus of it. So using very short delays instead of reverbs can be really, really powerful. And if you modulate the time of those delays just a little bit so that they have some imperfections in them, that will prevent flanging, phasing, etc. Because flanging, chorus, phasing, and comb filter, all of these effects are achieved with very, very short delays that do not have like a lot of feedback. These are also known as tap delays. And one of my favorite devices is a UAD modulated stereo tapped delay item, and it is abbreviated as the STD for stereo tapped delay. I'm like, you guys couldn't come up with another acronym than the STD? Like, I feel so weird putting STDs all over my sexy vocals, but it's not stupid if it works, right? It's not stupid if it works. But explore short delay times, explore how, searching and geeking out on how to create your own chorus effect, how to create your own reverb effect, how to create your own flanger, how to create your own comb filter with short delays. This is something that is worth geeking out on, and you can really make a vocal sit in front and on top and sound 3D by dimensionalizing it with short delays. Okay, so I think that given the time, that is where we're going to stop for today. But we will get into fidelity next time.